So, this video will be focusing only on Chapter 5, Civil Liberties. Chapter 6, which covers civil rights, will be in a separate video. It's just my teacher decided to clump it to one big presentation, but obviously I don't think you guys want to sit around for a 100+ slide presentation. So, our country, if you didn't know already, has a very deep commitment to freedom/liberty. This is very much rooted in the Anglo-American tradition. The whole phrase, as we know, the whole phrase, give me liberty or give me death, that we saw Patrick Henry. In our minds, liberty is inherent, inalienable, and you can't take it away, as stated in the Declaration of Independence. The preamble of our Constitution specifically says, we will secure the blessing of liberty. Of course, as we know, when these documents first came, when the United States first came into inception, those freedoms and liberties were only reserved for rich white men who are over 21. And this would be, ensuring that all people, regardless of their social status, race, age, or gender, the struggle to ensure that everyone has that right to freedom and liberty will be probably the defining motif of American history. The whole trying to ensure that our country lives up to the principles that were stated in its founding documents. It can always summarize in this quote: "The arc of the moral universe is long, but a bend toward justice." As said by Theodore Parker, later paraphrased by MLK himself. So, if you're wondering what is the difference between civil liberties and civil rights, I've always wondered this myself. It's that civil rights are protections by the government from, usually angry, racist white people, while civil liberties are protections from the government. In other words, civil rights are positive acts of government, i.e. laws against discrimination, and civil liberties are negatives, or protections against arbitrary acts of government. Congress shall make no law. So the first 10 amendments should or could have been called the Bill of Liberties. So, the whole point of this defense of liberty is the idea to create a government that will... The idea of, civil rights is to be an answer to this question. The condition of man is a condition of war of everyone against everyone. If there were no civil rights, people would just be, murdering each other, as we saw with, lynchings of immigrants, blacks, and Jews in this country. So basically these civil rights protect the minorities from getting murdered by the racist majority. We need government to protect us, but we also need protection from our government. So, despite the growth of our government in size, there's still lots of examples of limitations. For example, our founding documents, guarantee personal freedom. This is very different from dictatorships. Now, of course, sometimes, like I said, rights and liberties aren't always extended to everyone because of, the fact that our country, when it first started out, wasn't exactly very inclusive. The WASPs, or white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, said, these rights and liberties are only reserved to us, no one else. And part of the cultural conflict in this country is the struggle between, the WASPs who have the rights but refuse to give them out to everyone else, and everyone else who doesn't have rights but want to get those rights anyway. It's basically a 240+ year tension between them and later immigrants. As I think, MLK once said, the entitled never give up anything without pressure. And of course, we're starting to see an example of that, with white nationalism and populism at a 50-year high since the Civil Rights era. And we all know the white backlash to the Civil Rights era was very ugly indeed. Now, rights are relative, not absolute. Basically, as one put it, your rights end where my nose begins. For example, you can't falsely shout fire in a crowded theater for obvious reasons. And freedom of the press doesn't trump right to a fair trial. And, I think the Supreme Court ruled, yeah, you can't bring a concealed weapon into a Chipotle. Now, of course, Congress and courts restrict rights during wars and emergencies. We saw this with the Sedition Act in 1798 during the Quasi-War of France, the Espionage and Sedition Acts towards the end of the First World War, the Smith Act during the Second World War, the Internal Security Act during the Cold War, the Communist Control Act during the Cold War, also during the Cold War, and the Patriot Act in the wake of 9/11. These two, if you were wondering, they're basically designed to like really screw over like leftists and communists in the country, because we were in a confrontation with the Soviet Union. Now, the Bill of Rights only constrain what the national government can do, but most state constitutions also Bill of Rights. Now, one of the now, of course, now more importantly, state courts have now interpreted the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment to protect basic and essential and fundamental rights at the state level too. Basically, no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, as stated in the 14th Amendment. This doctrine or process of incorporation began in 1925. Most, but not all, Bill of Rights liberties have been merged/combined into the 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. So, if you want to know which rights have been incorporated into at the state level by the Supreme Court, here's a list of them. And these are the ones that have not been incorporated yet. Although, actually, the Second Amendment was incorporated in 2010. So this textbook is a little bit old. So here are some landmark cases incorporated that incorporated rights at the state level via the Due Process Clause. For Gideon versus Wainwright guaranteed a right to an attorney for the poor or indigent in a state felony case. McDonald versus Chicago, the Second Amendment right to keep and bear arms for self-defense is applicable to the states. Schneck versus the United States. Speech creating a clear and present danger is not protected. Now, this is a landmark First Amendment free expression case. Speech creating a clear and present danger is not protected by the First Amendment. Tigger versus Des Moines. Public school students have the right to wear black armbands in school to protest the Vietnam War. New York Times versus the United States. This bolstered the freedom of the press, establishing a heavy presumption against prior restraint, even in cases involving national security. Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission. Political spending by corporations, associations, and labor unions is a form of protected speech under the First Amendment. Now, there are some forms of speech that are not automatically given constitutional protection. Examples are libel and slander, obscenity, symbolic speech, false advertising. However, we certainly do err on the side of freedom because that's the United States. Now, in the United States, it is much harder to convict someone of libel in the U.S. than, say, in the U.K. The standard is that you were actually intended to, it's actual malice, basically. They have to find the guy accusing you of libel has to have actual evidence to say you were deliberately trying to defame this person's reputation, that you sincerely hated this person, yada yada yada. A reckless disregard for truth, especially if you're especially if you're a public figure. Now, obscenity is very fuzzy. As one Supreme Court justice once said, I'll know it when I see it. It all hinges on whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find that the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interests, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way that sexual conduct or excretory functions specifically defined by applicable state law, whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And in fact, nothing really is obscene anymore. 1969 was a big change year. The internet basically makes porn a lot more accessible. My teacher said at least an increase in yobishness, basically saying that men are basically not sexually attracted by anything anymore because they have become numb. Now, symbolic speech, depending on what it is can be or cannot be protected by the First Amendment. So, for example, when young men burned their draft cards in the 1960s, my world history teacher and gov teacher actually did this to protest the Vietnam War. The Supreme Court ruled that it was an illegal act for which they could be punished because the draft was a legitimate interest in the draft cards, had an actual purpose. They didn't want to open it up to the possibility of murder being classified as a symbolic speech. Good thing. Now, there are other examples of symbolic speech that have been allowed. Some of these which are very controversial. For example, Nazis could hold marches in Jewish neighborhoods. My gov teacher actually recalls one instance in which they were allowed to march for a neighborhood mostly comprised of Auschwitz survivors. Yeah, not pleasant, but I guess the Supreme Court ruled it was okay. Flag burning was ruled okay. Kneeling during the national anthem was certainly legal, but may get you fired by the NFL. False advertising is certainly not allowed. It's almost always policed by the industry itself, often at the request of a competitor. Now, of course, you still get a lot of puffery or blatant lying going on. For example, Kellogg's or cornflakes are the original and the best. Tide makes clothes whiter than white. Ginseng makes you smarter. You can probably think of other false ads, especially all those annoying nutrient supplements. Now, with useful speech, the Supreme Court has ruled that schools can't censor school-paid newspapers. However, students can protest war with symbolic armbands and Make America Great Again hats. Now, it is not okay to hold up signs saying "Buckets for Jesus." I can't believe that's because apparently some kid wore that off a t-shirt, got in trouble. Basically, the Supreme Court ruled it was illegal because it promoted dangerous activity. I gotta admit, I never thought this would actually be the curriculum. There is now corporate and union speech. There's little restriction on political corporate speech. So basically, the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court said, yeah, money is speech. You can basically pay a bunch of money to a super PAC or political action committee to get whatever message you want promoted. And interestingly, I think according to my teacher said that Democrat donors or Republican donors donate the same amount, but you might check me on that one. So another First Amendment protection is freedom of the press. That's pretty self-evident. You know, a newspaper can print whatever it wants as long as it doesn't classify as libel or slander, or if it's blatantly false or promotes dangerous activity. We also have the First Amendment and freedom of religion. We also have the freedom of religion clause in the First Amendment. Basically say that there are two components of the freedom of religion clause. The establishment clause, Congress will not establish a state religion, and the second one is the free exercise clause. Basically, if whatever religion you are, you have the right to exercise its practices up to a certain point. So some landmark First Amendment religious cases were Engel versus Vitale, school censorship of religious activities violates the establishment clause. Wisconsin versus Yoder, which stated compelling Amish students to attend school past the 8th grade violates the free exercise clause. If you're wondering why is freedom of religion such a big, important thing in our Constitution can you really actually think of any religiously tolerant society in the past? I mean, there were some like the Romans, Mongols, Chinese, and some Chinese dynasties and the Mughal Empire under wonder leaders, and some other Indian dynasties. But the problem is the problem with the majority of civilizations and human histories that they've been blatantly intolerant. Example is the Alhambra Decree of 1492 in Spain, which basically expelled all the Jews. And then the later decree that basically expelled all the Muslims. And the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, which basically of 1590 in France, which basically evicted all the Protestants, led to a massive brain drain and massive amounts of persecution against these groups, lynchings, inquisitions, arbitrary trials, just a whole lot of ugly crap. You also got the 30 Years' War between Catholics and Protestants, which killed 1/3 of Central Europe. Yeah, that would definitely, make you think, yeah, religious intolerance, bad idea. You also had, Henry VIII breaking for the Catholic Church, which caused hundreds of years of bloodshed and conflict in Britain, because you would have, one monarch would be Catholic, kill all the Protestants, and the next monarch would be Protestant, kill all the Catholics. It's just this mess. Colonial America itself was buffeted by many religious tensions, bigotry, and witch hunts, states would often promote their own churches, as well as the fact that there were many restrictions on what Jews and Catholics could do. If you are Jewish or Catholic, you could probably ask your grandparents or great grandparents, hey, could you get into a country club? No, they couldn't because of those restrictions. Like I said, there are two religious freedoms in the First Amendment. The first one is the Establishment Clause. The national government can't establish or endorse a religion. The Free Exercise Clause, just basically do your own thing. It was pushed hard by Jefferson and other deists, Quakers, Baptists, and Catholics. Interesting thing is that not only were Catholics and Jews screwed over by Protestants, certain groups of Protestants were also screwed over by the majority, like the Baptists. So, Jefferson's idea of a wall of separation between church and state was originally not in the Constitution. It was just taken from a letter he wrote. And it's not always practiced all the time. It's more like a semi-permeable membrane. For example, government supports all religions with a $70 to $80 billion in annual tax breaks. Other examples are like military chaplains, the phrase "So help me God," "Under God," and "In God we trust" that we have all over the country. Christmas cliches or nativity scenes and license plates. So here's some important Establishment Clause debate. Establishment Clause Supreme Court cases. For example, the 1947 New Jersey school bus case. It is okay to use tax dollars to bus students to religious schools. It subsidizes this in a way subsidizes religious instruction. The court uses student safety as a justification because the religious schools were the only good schools nearby, and they weren't going to bust us, and the Supreme Court didn't want to bust the students very far in potentially dangerous conditions to a non-religious school. How does this affect you today? Now, if you're wondering, how does this affect you today? It actually means that you can't sleep in it as much because now because you have to wake up early because the bus fleet has to bus to more schools, the religious schools, and so you have to wake up earlier. Hold on. Oh, crap. Yikes. Oh, looks like the PowerPoint kind of broke. Yikes. Sorry about that. Oh, shoot. Oh, crap. Okay. Sorry about that mess. Sometimes I'm not exactly very PowerPoint sometimes confuses me. So however, the Supreme Court, however, that doesn't mean as a religious school you get a huge amount of leeway. It is not okay if, for example, religious instruction is done on public property. If it's okay if students receive religious instruction on private property or off school grounds. Prayer and school prayers and Bible readings. There have been 7 SCOTUS decisions on this topic. School prayer was banned in 1962 of Anglo Vitale. The court also struck down posting the 10 commandments in schools, moments of silence or time periods of meditation and voluntary prayer at graduation, or student-led prayer at high school football games. I think, actually, funny enough, our school football coach actually led a prayer. It's a video on YouTube. If you're just looking up, Tony Arcuri leads a prayer or something, it has 1 million views on YouTube. Basically, he led a prayer during before a football game, and that by the definition of the Constitution is illegal. Of course, that's an example of rulings not fully obeyed even today. So, student religious groups have been ruled to be okay since 1984, as long as they meet on same terms as other student organizations. In this case, the First Amendment free speech clause trumped the First Amendment establishment clause. Now in 1968, the Supreme Court struck down an Arkansas's law that forbade the teaching of evolution. The state has no legitimate, the Supreme Court justified by saying, the state has no legitimate interest in protecting any or all religions from views distasteful to them. This was a descendant of the Scopes monkey trial in 1925 that convicted a biology teacher for teaching evolution. The case was thrown out on a technicality. Now, I personally wonder, why is the theory of evolution more controversial than the theory of gravity? Probably because our country is very religious, and as a result, there's a lot of pushback against evolution, against the theory of natural selection that directly contradicts many religious teachings. In 1987, the court struck down a Louisiana law requiring that creation science be taught alongside evolution. Creation science is basically another way of saying, God created everything, whatnot. Regarding financial aid to religious schools, the aid must pass the Lemon test from a 1971 Lemon versus Kurzban case. For number one, a law must have a secular, not a religious purpose. It must neither advance nor inhibit religion. It must not foster an excessive entanglement of government and religion. There have been many decisions since then, some of them quite contradictory. It's all part of the sectarian versus secular culture wars. So, aid to religious schools that is not considered okay under the Lemon case is using it to pay teacher salaries at a religious school, field trips, or direct reimbursement of religious school tuition. What is okay to pay with public funds, busing to religious schools. Standardized testing costs interpreted from deaf students, and tax deductions for school tuition. And in 2002, vouchers for poor students to use at religious schools. Now, some other non-school establishment cases in which religion is kind of allowed is Congress always opens with a prayer because adults aren't susceptible to indoctrination like kids. As of 2012, it's okay to open school board meetings with prayers as long as it rotates. So that means you can also have atheist prayers. 10 commandments in public spaces are not okay unless there's lots of other stuff. Seasonal displays are okay, like the nativity scenes, as long as there's a Santa nearby or any other secular symbol. In our school district, there's actually a nativity scene, and it's probably unconstitutional unless the live donkeys somehow help. But the school district decided to throw in a menorah in there just to make it constitutional to display other religions. Now, the second religious clause of the First Amendment is the free exercise clause. We can basically believe in anything we want to. However, there is obviously some limits on religious behaviors. The court has swung back and forth on this. The secular generally applicable law comes before religion. That's basically the basis the court has ruled on. And it usually dictates how much does the court accommodate certain religious practices. Basically, does the state have a compelling interest in preventing some religious practices? You can summarize this court standard in that phrase. Or does the religious practice present a third-party burden? So, examples of the freedom exercise clause being limited: Mormons can't practice polygamy. Indians can't take peyote, but later a Brazilian American religious group could. Charismatic Christians can't deploy poisonous snakes for obvious reasons. Jews can't wear yarmulkes while on active military duty, and state laws can't require stores to close on Sundays, or blue laws. Funny enough, in many places in Europe, they still actually have these. I went to Germany over the summer once, and all the stores were closed on Sunday. Now, examples of the free exercise clause being upheld is you don't need a license to solicit money for religious cause anymore. Which in many that seems kind of obvious, because if you need a license by the state could basically control who who which religions can solicit money for their cause. Amish children don't need to attend school beyond the 8th grade. You can actually perform animal sacrifices. You have a right to not salute the flag. Jehovah's Witnesses consider this idolatry. Hobby Lobby, the Hobby Lobby family business doesn't have to provide birth control as part of their employee health plans, and religious gerrymandering is not allowed. Basically, voting districts drawn up to favor a certain religious group over another. So, some examples of freedom of religion clause, freedom of religion being contested is the Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission. Basically, the case centers on whether creative businesses can refuse services due to its First Amendment rights of free speech and free exercise of religion by refusing to provide creative services such as custom wedding cakes for same-sex marriage ceremonies on the basis of one's religious beliefs. The cake shop argues that religious and philosophical objections to same-sex marriage are protected views. As overall, this whole freedom of religion thing is a case-by-case evolving common sense decision. Is like sorry, let me rephrase that. I'm so sorry. Basically, it's the whole the Supreme Court decides what is protected under freedom of religion, what is not, on a case-by-case basis. Oh gosh, darn it. Why does the... Oh my gosh. So... Sometimes, this PowerPoint doesn't exactly be cooperative. I'm so sorry. So, the other part of Chapter 5 is crime and a due process of law. Now, what does due process mean? It means the government must act fairly and in accord with established rules. The whole, equal justice under the law thing chiseled on the Supreme Court building. It must not be arbitrary, capricious, or unreasonable. Basically, it must be fair. Now, there are two kinds of due process. Procedural due process, the procedure, which is basically the procedures, the methods, and the how of government action that must be fair. For example, the police need warrants. There must be no double jeopardy. They can't pump your stomach for evidence. This goes way back in the English legal tradition. There's also substantive due process. The substance or the meaning, the what of a law or action policy of government must be fair. For example, the government can't require parents send their kids to public schools. This interpretation was a late 19th century American invention. Now, due process. This is getting very confusing, and I'm terribly sorry. The due process is in the Fifth Amendment of the Bill of Rights, but this due process is only applied to the federal government, not the states. There's also another due process clause in the 14th Amendment that guarantees due process to the state, at the state and local level. States shall make no law, and it's not just Congress shall make no law. This was part of the Reconstruction period in order to guarantee that blacks had protections of rights in the post-Civil War South. Unfortunately, that Reconstruction period ended, and as a result, that's where you get all those horrible lynchings. Now, since 1925, the courts have used the 14th Amendment to incorporate or apply almost all the Bill of Rights to the states. So yeah, here's a nice little diagram for the fifth for due process. If you want to, I'd recommend pausing the video and taking a look at this because it does get confusing. Now, many scholars think that the whole substantive due process is just an oxymoron and a judicial usurpation. The process does not equal substance. Should be called due substance. This all gets into legal semantics. This allows the courts to legislate from the bench. It was first used as a way to discriminate against ex-slaves in direct opposition to the original intent of the 14th Amendment. The privileges and immunities clause in the 14th Amendment, which was intended to protect civil rights, was basically read out of the Constitution in 1887 by a racist Supreme Court. Basically, the Supreme Court said, this whole thing in the 14th Amendment that protects blacks from getting murdered by racist whites and protects them from the government from stripping them of their liberties. Yeah, this thing doesn't exist. So it took a while for the country to kind of pick up on this. It was revived in 2010 in the McDonald versus Chicago case under Clarence Thomas. Now, when it comes to freedom and security when it comes to police power is one of the critical powers reserved for or by the states. Police power in its legal sense extends far beyond safety and cops to include health, morals, and general welfare. Now, police power often comes in conflict with civil liberties. The courts must strike a balance between the needs of society on one hand and the needs of the individual on the other. Does societies need to protect itself allow police to force a drunk driving suspect to give a blood sample? So, some examples of this in which the state was examples of state police power to promote health is limiting the sale of tobacco and requiring vaccinations. To promote an example of a state power to promote safety is I'm having some issues here. Is regulate carrying concealed weapons and require the use of seatbelts. To promote morals, outlawing gambling and prostitution, promoting the general welfare, compulsory education laws and regulations on public utility profits. Now, of course, when we think of police power, you probably think of the whole, what can the police search and what can they not search? This is part of the Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure, which covers the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects. Against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Basically, you need a probable cause to get a warrant to search a home. But, however, there have been some exceptions. For example, you might only just need reasonable suspicion to conduct a stop and to do a stop and frisk. But search or seizure cannot be based entirely on an anonymous tip or a hunch. Now, the whole reasonable suspicion thing is generally required in schools. This is why, the police can get their police dogs out and just start, sniffing for drugs in their lockers just based on a suspicion, because the Supreme Court according to Supreme Court, basically because the school is responsible for your protection, they have a right to inspect your lockers for drugs and contraband. Now, the police have more flexibility with automobiles because there's a potential flight risk. Arrests based on informational auto roadblocks are ruled okay. Basically, while you're allowed to do an inspection while stopping people to ask about hit and run, and the police start smelling alcohol. Now, we do have something called the exclusionary rule, in which evidence gained as the result of an illegal act by police cannot be used at the trial of the person from whom it was seized, including, you can't get the fruit of the poisonous tree. This was established in 1961 via Mapp versus Ohio and went against a long tradition of preventing abuse via taking the violating police person to court. Almost no other country does it our way. This is very controversial because the criminal can basically can get out of jail based on a technicality. We saw this with O.J. Simpson. His defense team was able to get almost all the evidence obtained by the prosecuting side thrown out of court, and O.J. got away with it. Some exceptions to the exclusionary rule are inevitable discovery. The evidence would have been discovered anyway. The knock and announce violation, the police can barge in if evidence is being destroyed. Like, for example, they hear a toilet flushing because the criminals trying to flush down evidence down the toilet. Good faith. If police thought they had a good warrant. Honest mistakes. If police entered the wrong apartment of a suspect by accident. Now, another important thing on the part of the another important civil liberty is the whole Miranda rights. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law, so be careful. You have the right to have an attorney. If you cannot afford one will be appointed to you by the court. This was, guaranteed at the state level by the Gideon versus Wainwright case. Drug testing programs are allowed for workers, starting with law enforcement and railroad workers. Kind of obvious because you don't want, police officers and the guys building your train tracks to be high or working your train tracks. It's allowed for students, starting with athletes. Almost all big companies do drug testing on new employees. Many do just do random or spot checks. Now, a huge restriction on the whole no unreasonable search and seizure thing is the Patriot Act. Basically, this allows secret sneak and peek searches as long as there was a warrant. Federal agents can search your home or office without telling you about it for months. Wiretapping is now widely used in the United States. Originally, courts didn't consider eavesdropping to be a search since it was not physical, so no warrants required. Since then, court has now protected persons and not just places. Even public phones are protected wherever a person has a reasonable expectation of privacy. Now, of course, after 9/11, we have with the Patriot Act and with massive increases in NSA powers after basically since after 9/11, the Fourth Amendment has been severely restricted. Fourth Amendment rights have been severely restricted as part of the whole war on terror. For example, the NSA has done countless warrantless wiretaps of U.S. citizens, but cell phones were protected as of 2014. There's a lot of ambiguity regarding Guantanamo. You also have FISA courts and the Trump dossier, and that is Chapter 5. Chapter 6 will be covered in a separate video. So yeah, that will be all.